I baked Gideon Marsh a pie every single year on his birthday, the 3rd of June each year, ever since my husband Daniel died and left me running 80 acres alone with a boy not yet 10 years old to raise on it. I never thought much about why I kept doing it, past the plain fact that a widow with a good oven and more rhubarb than she knew what to do with owed her nearest neighbor some kind of thanks for the number of times he'd shown up unasked to fix a fence or haul water when my own 2 hands weren't enough for the job. Looking back, I understand now that a woman doesn't keep doing a small kindness for 2 years running without some part of her already knowing exactly why she's doing it, even if the rest of her spent those 2 years pretending otherwise. Daniel and I had built the homestead together over 9 years, a modest 2-room house with a good root cellar he dug the first summer we were married, 80 acres of wheat and hay along a creek that ran reliable even in dry years, and a small orchard he'd planted the spring before Sam was born. Apple and plum trees I still tended myself every year, though he never lived to see them bear proper fruit. He'd been a careful, steady man, not given to much talk, and I'd loved him in the particular, unremarkable way 2 people love each other after 9 years of shared work and shared weather, a love I hadn't fully understood the size of until it was gone. Gideon's place sat 1.5 miles east of mine, closer to town, but bigger by a fair margin, 400 acres of good grazing land he'd built up over 20 years, most of them spent married to a woman named Ruth who died of a fever a decade back, leaving him the same particular kind of alone that widowhood leaves a person, though he'd carried it a good deal longer than I'd carried mine. He ran the place mostly alone by then, with the help of 2 hired hands during the busy seasons, a solitary competence that the town had come to admire, and an equal measure to worry over. Several of the more matchmaking-minded women having tried and failed over the years to interest him in one eligible widow or another without ever once succeeding. He'd never remarried, and the town had long since stopped speculating about why, having settled comfortably into the assumption that Gideon Marsh was simply a man built for solitude, gruff and capable, and entirely uninterested in anything a wife might offer beyond what he could already manage on his own. If I lost the 80 acres Daniel had left me, I would lose the only thing standing between Sam and a childhood spent depending on the charity of relatives who'd made their disapproval of my staying out here plain enough in their letters. My late husband's sister, Verna, wrote from Ohio at least twice a year with the same careful, well-meaning suggestion, dressed in slightly different language each time, that a widow alone on a homestead was inviting ruin, that Sam deserved a stable household with proper male guidance, that I ought to sell the land while it still held value and bring the boy east to live nearer family who could help raise him right. I answered each letter politely and declined each suggestion just as politely, though the fear underneath those declines was real enough that I sometimes read Verna's letters twice before I worked up the resolve to write back. That was the stakes underneath everything else in those first 2 years. A fear I carried quiet and constant, the kind that makes a woman work herself half to exhaustion rather than admit out loud how close to the edge she's actually standing. Gideon showing up to fix what needed fixing without ever once making me feel like charity was being extended had become one of the few things standing between that fear and the actual disaster it threatened. The first pie was nothing more than plain gratitude, delivered to his porch on his 51st birthday, with Sam trailing behind me carrying a jar of preserves I'd added at the last minute, feeling foolish for making more of the occasion than the man himself likely wanted made of it. I'd debated the whole ride over whether the gesture was too much or not nearly enough, whether a widow showing up unannounced at a bachelor rancher's door with baked goods might be read as forward in ways I hadn't intended, and I'd nearly turned the wagon around twice before Sam, impatient with my hesitating, pointed out that Gideon had hauled water for us 3 separate times that spring without once being asked, and that a pie seemed like the least a decent neighbor could manage in return. His plain 12-year-old logic settled the matter more firmly than any of my own careful deliberating had managed, and we continued on to Gideon's place with the pie balanced carefully on my lap the whole way. He'd answered the door in his shirt sleeves, surprised into something close to speechlessness by the sight of a rhubarb pie held out toward him on a plate he'd have to remember to return, and he'd thanked me in about 4 words total before retreating back inside like a man unused to being on the receiving end of anything. I remember standing on that porch afterward, Sam already halfway back to the wagon, feeling a little foolish for the whole gesture, wondering if I'd overstepped some boundary of frontier propriety I hadn't fully considered before riding over. I decided on the ride home that I'd done a decent neighborly thing regardless of how awkwardly it had been received, and that whatever Gideon Marsh made of a pie was his business and not mine to worry over further. The second pie, the following June, came easier, both of us having settled by then into an understanding that neighbors did this kind of thing for each other out here, that a birthday pie carried no more weight than a borrowed plow or a shared afternoon of branding calves. I stayed on his porch a while longer that second year, except in the coffee he offered almost reflexively, and we talked for the better part of an hour about nothing of particular consequence: the price of cattle, a fence line that needed mending come fall, whether the rains would hold long enough to save the wheat. It was an easy, unremarkable conversation, the kind 2 neighbors have dozens of times without either one thinking twice about it, except that I found myself thinking about it a good deal more than twice in the days that followed. I noticed, in the days after that second visit, small details about him I hadn't paid particular attention to before. The careful, unhurried way he considered a question before answering it, the specific creases at the corners of his eyes that deepened when something struck him as genuinely funny rather than merely polite, the fact that he'd remembered from some passing comment I'd made a full year earlier that I preferred my coffee without sugar. None of these observations amounted to anything I was prepared to name at the time, but I found myself cataloging them anyway, the way a person collects small evidence toward a conclusion they aren't yet ready to reach. The wound I carried into that second pie, the one I hadn't fully named even to myself, went back to the particular manner of Daniel's death. A hunting accident, his own rifle discharging as he climbed through a fence line, quick and senseless and entirely without warning, leaving me a widow at 32 with a 10-year-old boy and 80 acres I barely knew how to run. I'd spent the 2 years since telling myself that grief of that particular suddenness didn't leave room for anything as frivolous as wanting a man's company again, that any attention I paid to a neighbor's gruff kindness was gratitude and nothing more, because admitting otherwise felt like a betrayal of a marriage that had ended before either of us had any say in the matter. There had been no illness to prepare for with Daniel, no long decline that let a person grieve in advance and arrive at the actual death already partway reconciled to it. There had only been an ordinary Tuesday morning, him climbing through a fence line same as he'd done 1,000 times before, and then a neighbor riding up white-faced within the hour to tell me what had happened, and the particular violence of that suddenness had left me for the better part of a year afterward, half convinced that any peace or contentment I found again would somehow be an insult to how abruptly he'd been taken from it. Gideon's own wound, I came to understand slowly over that second year, ran differently but no less deep. Ruth had died of a fever that took 3 days to run its course, 3 days in which he'd sat beside her bed doing everything a country doctor could suggest and watching none of it work. And he'd told me once, in the particular flat voice men use when they're describing something too large to feel properly in the moment of telling it, that he'd decided somewhere in those 3 days that a man who let himself need someone that much was a man setting himself up to be gutted by the losing of him, and that he'd been more careful about needing people ever since. He told me this the same afternoon, sitting on his own porch with an empty coffee cup between his hands. In a voice so carefully flat, I understood he'd rehearsed keeping it that way through years of practice at not letting the memory show on his face. He said Ruth had asked him, somewhere in that third day, whether he'd remarry after, a question he'd refused to answer honestly at the time because he couldn't bear to imagine a version of his life that continued past losing her. He said he'd kept that same refusal going for 10 years afterward, not out of any remaining loyalty to a promise he'd never actually made, but out of a plain, practical fear that he'd built his whole understanding of safety around never again caring about anyone enough for their loss to gut him the way Ruth's had. The first real turning point came at the third pie, the one I brought him on his 53rd birthday, when Sam, 12 by then, sharp-eyed and entirely too observant for his own good, blurted out on a ride over that he thought Gideon ought to just marry Mama already and save everybody the trouble of pretending the pies were only about pie. I hadn't known how to answer that from the wagon seat, my face going hot despite the June heat, and by the time we reached Gideon's porch, I'd half convinced myself Sam would have the good sense to keep the observation to himself. He did not. He said it again, plain as anything, the moment Gideon opened the door, and Gideon, to his enormous credit and my considerable mortification, didn't laugh it off or scold the boy for impertinence. He simply looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable working behind his eyes, before saying in the gruff, economical way he said most things, that marrying me sounded like a fine idea if I ever got tired of just bringing pie. Sam, entirely unbothered by the weight of what he'd just set loose between two grown adults, had already wandered off toward Gideon's barn to look at a new calf, leaving the two of us standing on that porch in a silence that felt considerably longer than the few seconds it probably actually lasted. I remember the specific heat climbing up my neck, the sudden urgent need to look anywhere but directly at Gideon's face, and the particular way the June cicadas seemed to get louder in that stretch of quiet, as though the whole valley were waiting along with us to see what either of us would say next. I laughed it off. That was the safest thing to do with a comment like that, delivered as it clearly was in the spirit of defusing a 12-year-old's overly direct meddling. And Gideon laughed along with me, and we ate pie on his porch same as every other year, and neither of us mentioned it again that whole visit. Sam, for his part, seemed entirely satisfied with having planted the seed and made no further comment on the matter for the rest of the afternoon, occupying himself instead with a litter of barn kittens he'd discovered while I sat with Gideon on the porch, our conversation notably more careful and considered than it had been the year before, both of us picking our words with the particular caution of people who'd just had something significant said aloud that neither was quite ready to address directly. But I found myself turning the comment over on the ride home, the particular way he'd said it, not quite joking all the way through, and I understood somewhere on that 1.5 miles of dirt road that I'd wanted him to mean it a good deal more than I was prepared to admit even to myself. The dark turn, if a story built on pie and porch conversations can be said to have one, came that autumn when word reached me through the particular efficient gossip channels of a small town that Gideon had been seen twice at dinner with a widow visiting from Bozeman, a Mrs. Aldrich, whose sister lived 2 farms over just east of the county line, and who was, by every account that reached me, handsome, well-off, and entirely unencumbered by a 12-year-old son or 80 acres of debt-shadowed land. Mrs. Pruitt, who ran the mercantile counter and considered the accurate reporting of local news to be a civic duty second only to church attendance, delivered the particulars to me with the kind of detailed relish that made plain she'd been saving the story for exactly the right audience. She said Mrs. Aldridge had been seen twice now at the hotel dining room with Gideon, both occasions lasting well past a proper dinner hour, and that a woman of her particular refinement and means seemed, by Mrs. Pruitt's careful estimation, exactly the sort of match a man like Gideon ought to have been considering for years, instead of wasting his evenings on porch conversations with a widow scraping by on 80 struggling acres. I told myself it changed nothing, that whatever half-formed hope I'd been quietly nursing since the joke on his porch had no real claim on him at all, that a widower rancher was entitled to court whoever he pleased without owing explanation to a neighbor who brought him pie once a year. I told myself this with a conviction that didn't survive more than a few days of watching Sam's face fall every time he asked whether Gideon was coming to help with the harvest, and I had to say I didn't know. I saw them together once, in town, Mrs. Aldridge on Gideon's arm outside the mercantile, both of them laughing at something I couldn't hear, and I understood with a clarity that embarrassed me for how sharp it cut that I had let myself want something I'd never once given either of us permission to want out loud. I had come into town that day for nothing more consequential than a sack of cornmeal and a spool of thread. And I remember standing frozen at the edge of the boardwalk a full moment longer than the sighting warranted, watching Gideon hand Mrs. Aldridge up into a hired buggy with a courtesy I'd never once seen him extend to me, though I told myself immediately after that such an observation was petty and unfair, that a man was entitled to be courteous to whoever he pleased. I finished my errands quickly after that and drove home faster than the road strictly required, arriving with my eyes stinging in a way I blamed, unconvincingly even to myself, on the dust. I went home that day and told myself plainly that whatever this had been, it was over before it had properly started, and that the sensible thing now was to let the pies stop, to let Gideon Marsh find whatever comfortable, well-off companionship suited a man of his standing, and to focus on the 80 acres and the boy who actually needed me. I didn't bake a pie that following June. I told Sam it had simply slipped my mind, though he was 12 and sharp enough to know a lie when he heard one, and he didn't press me on it, though the disappointment on his face when Gideon's birthday came and went without the usual trip east told me plainly enough what he thought of my decision. Gideon didn't come by to ask why either, which I told myself was proof enough that the pie had never meant to him what it had come to mean to me, that Mrs. Aldridge or someone like her had likely filled whatever small gap in his life a neighbor's yearly baking had once occupied. That whole summer settled into a particular flat quiet I didn't examine too closely, the ordinary work of the homestead continuing much as it always had, haying and mending and the slow, patient business of keeping 80 acres solvent through another season, but with something missing from the rhythm of it that I couldn't quite name aloud even to myself. Sam asked twice more that summer whether we might ride over to Gideon's for some reason or another, and both times I found some plausible excuse to decline, aware, even as I made them, that I was avoiding something rather than simply too busy for a visit, though admitting that plainly still felt beyond me. The turning point came from Sam, in the plain, unfiltered way only a 12-year-old delivers hard truths. He found me in the kitchen a week after Gideon's birthday had passed unmarked, and he asked, without any of the careful diplomacy an adult might have used, whether I'd stopped baking the pie because I was scared or because I didn't care anymore. Because those were the only two reasons he could think of, and he didn't believe for 1 second it was the second one. I stood there with flour still on my hands from an entirely different task and found I didn't have a ready answer, because he'd named the exact fear I'd been too proud to name to myself, and hearing it said plainly by my own son undid something I'd been holding together through sheer stubborn avoidance. I sat down at the kitchen table across from him, flour still on my hands, and told him the truth as plainly as I understood it myself at that point, that I'd seen Gideon with another woman in town, that I'd assumed the worst without ever once asking him directly what it meant, and that stopping the pie felt safer than finding out for certain that I'd been foolish to hope for anything more than plain gratitude between two neighbors who happened to share a fence line and not much else, or so I'd been telling myself all that long, quiet summer. Sam, with the particular blunt wisdom of a boy not yet old enough to have learned adult caution, told me that seemed like a poor way to find anything out, and that if I was going to be scared of an answer, I might as well be scared of the right one instead of just guessing at the wrong one and calling it settled. I baked the pie the next morning, 3 weeks late and with no birthday to attach it to, and I rode it over to Gideon's place myself, without Sam this time, because whatever I needed to say felt like it belonged to just the two of us. He answered the door surprised, the pie clearly not expected, and I stood there on his porch with my heart going harder than the ride out had earned, and told him plainly that I'd let a rumor about Mrs. Aldridge scare me into stopping something I hadn't had any right to be scared of stopping, because I'd never once told him what the pies had actually come to mean to me, and that wasn't fair to either of us. The ride over had given me too much time to rehearse and abandon a dozen different versions of what I meant to say, none of which felt adequate once I was actually standing in front of him with the pie growing heavier in my arms by the second. What came out instead was closer to plain confession than the careful explanation I'd planned, tumbling out faster than I'd intended. And I remember watching Gideon's face carefully for any sign of how badly I'd misjudged the whole situation, bracing myself for the particular humiliation of having said too much to a man who'd perhaps genuinely moved on to someone more suited to him. He was quiet a long moment on that porch, the pie still balanced between my two hands like I hadn't quite worked out yet whether he wanted it. Then he told me something that reframed the whole autumn I'd spent quietly grieving something I'd never had a claim to grieve. He said Mrs. Aldridge had been his late wife Ruth's cousin, visiting to settle some family business about a piece of land Ruth had once had claim to, and that the dinners had been about probate paperwork and nothing else, dull as any legal matter could be, and that he'd been so consumed those months with a lawyer's letters and a land survey that he hadn't noticed my June pie failing to arrive until the whole business was settled, and he found himself, one ordinary evening, wondering why I hadn't come by. He said the probate matter had turned out more complicated than either he or Mrs. Aldridge had expected, a boundary dispute tangled up with old deed language from Ruth's father's original claim, and that the dinners at the hotel had mostly consisted of the two of them and a county surveyor poring over faded property maps, rather than anything resembling courtship. He said he'd found the whole business tedious enough that it hadn't occurred to him, until it was over, how the sight of it from the outside might have looked entirely different to someone who didn't know the particulars. I felt something close to relief, and something close to foolishness in about equal measure, standing there with a rumor unraveling in real time. The whole weight of a summer's worth of quiet grief suddenly revealed as grief over nothing at all, which was its own strange kind of loss to reckon with, even as the actual news was good. Gideon, watching my face work through both of those feelings, said the thing he hadn't quite managed to say plainly the year before, on his 53rd birthday, in front of a 12-year-old boy who'd forced the subject open before either of us was ready for it. He said he'd meant it, that day, more than he'd let either of us believe at the time, and that he'd spent the months since telling himself a man his age with a decade of careful, deliberate solitude behind him had no business hoping for anything as complicated as wanting a widow with a growing boy and 80 acres of her own to worry about. He said watching that hope nearly die quiet over a rumor that wasn't even true had taught him he wasn't half as good at protecting himself from needing someone as he'd spent 10 years believing he was. I asked him, standing there with the pie finally set down between us on the porch rail, why he hadn't simply ridden over himself sometime that summer to ask why the pie had stopped coming, rather than letting a whole season pass in silence on both our parts. He admitted, with the particular reluctant honesty of a man unused to examining his own motives too closely, that he'd been afraid of exactly the answer I might give him, that I'd simply decided, on sober reflection, that a gruff rancher 20 years further along than me in age and considerably further along in solitary habits wasn't worth the trouble of continuing to court, however gently, and that he'd rather live with an unanswered question than risk hearing that particular answer said plainly. The resolution didn't arrive as a single dramatic proposal delivered on bended knee, though Sam, when he heard the full story later, expressed considerable disappointment about that particular fact. What happened instead was smaller, and truer for its smallness. Gideon asked, standing there on his porch with my pie finally handed over and cooling on the rail beside us, whether I'd consider letting him ask me properly, without a joke to hide behind, and without a 12-year-old forcing the question before either of us was ready. And I told him he could ask whenever he liked, because I'd apparently been ready a good deal longer than either of us had let ourselves admit. He didn't ask that same day. He waited, deliberately, until the following June, my 35th birthday falling close enough to his own that we'd taken to marking both occasions together over the 2 years since that porch conversation, and he asked me properly then, with a ring he'd apparently been carrying in his coat pocket for the better part of a month, working up the nerve, kneeling on the same porch boards where he'd first made the joke that started all of it, and Sam, watching from the wagon with an expression of profound and vindicated satisfaction, informed us both that he'd known this was coming since he was 12 years old, and that we'd taken entirely too long to catch up to him. Those intervening months, waiting for whatever came next, passed easier than I'd have expected, both of us settling into a courtship that finally had no joke to hide behind and no rumor to unravel, just the plain, steady business of two people learning each other properly after 2 years of circling the question sideways. Gideon came to Sunday dinner most weeks that autumn and winter, and I rode over to help him through calving season the following spring, the way I'd once only brought him pie. And somewhere in all that ordinary shared work, the particular careful distance we'd both maintained for 2 years simply stopped mattering, the way ice stops mattering to a creek once the thaw has properly set in. We were married that autumn, on a mild October afternoon, with the wheat already in and the whole valley smelling of cut hay and wood smoke. And I baked one more pie that season, not for a birthday, but simply because the habit had become something closer to a language between us by then, a way of saying a thing that plain words still sometimes struggled to carry. The wedding itself was a small, warm affair by most local standards, held in the small clapboard church in town, with perhaps 30 guests total, most of them longtime neighbors who'd watched the two of us dance around each other for the better part of 3 long years with a patience I hadn't fully appreciated until I saw how visibly relieved half of them looked when the preacher finally pronounced us married. Mrs. Pruitt, who'd been the original source of the Mrs. Aldridge gossip that had cost us the better part of a year, cried through the entire ceremony, and later claimed with a perfectly straight face and not a trace of visible shame to have known all along how things would turn out, a claim I chose not to dispute given the joyful occasion. Sam stood up beside Gideon as his witness, having appointed himself to the role some months earlier with an authority neither of us had thought seriously to question, and he wore, for the first time in his life without complaint, a proper collared shirt his Aunt Verna had sent from Ohio specifically for the occasion, having finally, grudgingly accepted that his nephew's mother had built a good life out here worth celebrating properly rather than rescuing him from at any cost. Gideon ate the whole first slice before either of us said anything at all, and then he looked up at me across his own kitchen table, the one that had become mine too by then, and said, in the gruff, economical way he said most things that mattered, that he intended to keep eating my pie for as many birthdays as either of us had left, and that he'd meant every word of that first joke on the porch every single year since, even the years he hadn't found the courage to say so out loud. The two households had folded into one that autumn, without a great deal of formal ceremony beyond the wedding itself. Sam and I moving into Gideon's larger, sturdier house, my own place rented out to a young family just starting on their own claim, the 80 acres now generating steady income rather than sitting as the sole anxious burden they'd once been. Sam took to ranch life on Gideon's spread with an enthusiasm that suggested he'd been waiting years for a steady man's presence in his daily chores, and Gideon, for his part, took to fatherhood with a seriousness that surprised even him, teaching Sam to break horses and read cattle brands with the same patient, economical instruction he'd once used to teach me how a homestead widow ought to properly negotiate grain prices at the county market. I told him I'd known that for longer than I'd let either of us admit. He said that sounded about right for the both of us. We sat there a while longer at that kitchen table, the pie slowly disappearing between us, the particular comfortable quiet settling over the room that I'd come to recognize, over 3 years of knowing him, as Gideon's version of contentment. Not the easy, talkative comfort some marriages might have, but something steadier, built out of two people who'd each already survived losing someone and decided, carefully and deliberately, that the risk of caring again was worth taking a second time, worth every awkward pie and every silent June and every rumor that had briefly convinced us both otherwise. I thought, watching him across that table, of all the small evidence I'd gathered without naming it that second June. The way he remembered my coffee, the creases at his eyes when something struck him as genuinely funny, the particular gruff economy of his kindness, and understood that I'd been right to trust that evidence long before either of us had found the courage to act on it, right from that very first awkward exchange on his porch when he could barely manage 4 words of thanks for a pie. Sam came through the kitchen sometime after supper, 14 by then and already taller than I was, and helped himself to a slice of pie without asking, the particular casual entitlement of a boy who'd stopped thinking of this house as anything other than fully his own. He asked, around a mouthful of rhubarb, whether we intended to keep making him wait a year for pie now that we were properly married, and Gideon told him, with the dry humor I'd come to love as much as anything else about the man, that a boy who'd forced the whole courtship into the open at 12 years old had no business complaining about the pace of anything that came after. Sam considered this a moment, shrugged, and cut himself a second slice, apparently satisfied that justice, however delayed, had eventually been served all around. Then he asked, plain and unhurried, whether I'd bake him another one next June, and I told him he didn't have to ask. He asked anyway, the following spring and every spring after that, some small ritual question that had stopped being about the answer and become simply another quiet way of saying the same thing we'd both finally learned how to say plainly, that neither of us intended to let the other one go without a fight. Not this time. Not ever again.